Monday, Tuesday, I believe, is a public holiday. But it's not only a public holiday, it's actually also a Jewish holiday. So it's important for us to know what is this Jewish holiday. It is called Pesach Sheni. What does Pesach Sheni mean? Well, literally it means second Pesach. Okay, it marks the day when someone who was unable to participate in the original Korban Pesach sacrifice offering in the proper time would be able to observe this mitzvah 1 month later. It's not as renowned of a holiday as Pesach itself. For those of you who are at the retreat, maybe we want to go back to another Pesach retreat, right? Perfect opportunity to do so. But the way it's customarily celebrated is simply by just eating matzah and shmura matzah if possible. And we don't say tachanun, we don't say any of those supplication prayers from in the prayers starting from already Sundays, from Sunday evening. So it's a way to have a little bit, I guess, a little bit extra, a little bit of a break, something to celebrate. Now, how Pesach Sheni came about? What's this holiday about? We don't have a second Sukkot. We don't have a second Rosh Hashanah. We don't have a second Hanukkah or Purim or any other holiday. So why is it that we have a second Pesach? And the story goes, it's not this week's Parsha. Hopefully we'll learn this week's Parsha tomorrow a little bit. But it's actually from the book of Bamidbar, and I want to actually study a little bit of the text with you, even though I didn't prepare it in today's slides. But the story goes that a year after the Exodus, God instructed the people of Israel to bring the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. Remember, the very first Pesach occurred 3,333 years ago, the year of the Exodus. That's the year 2448 from creation. That's the very first Pesach. That's even before they left Egypt. But a year after the Exodus, that means when the Jews are already in the wilderness. This is after the story of the golden calf. This is after we got the Torah at Mount Sinai. A year later, God said, you are to observe Pesach, to offer the sacrifice, the Paschal lamb in the desert on the 14th of Nisan. And they were to eat it that evening, just as we celebrate Pesach today, right? They were to roast their lamb over a fire, eat it together with matzah and maror, bitter herbs. It was going to, just like they did the year before they even left Egypt. Now, the Torah says to us that there were certain individuals, certain people who, for whatever reasons, were unable to participate on that day. Why? Well, they were ritually impure, and the Torah tells us a ritually impure person cannot participate in the Korban Pesach. And therefore, because they weren't able to participate, they had a problem. And they came to their leaders, to Moshe and Aaron, and they said, why should we be deprived? In fact, their words in the Torah are lama nigara. Why should we be left out? We also want to participate. It's not through any fault of our own why we can't be part of it. And why couldn't they be part of it? We're going to go through the details just now. They were involved in other mitzvahs. They were taking care of the dead. And those who, that if you come in contact with a dead body, that's ritual impurity. And therefore one can't offer the Korban Pesach. So because I'm involved in one mitzvah, I can't do the other mitzvah. They complained. And guess what? God responded. Good point you're making. We'll give you another chance. And that's the meaning of Pesach Sheni, second Pesach. And what I want to talk with you today is what that represents in our life. The idea of how we can actually make things up. It's never too late. My 2-year-old daughter, Michal, runs around singing us a little song. It's Pesach Sheni, don't be lazy, you got another chance. So although this holiday is not as renowned as Pesach itself, or probably as many other minor Jewish holidays, and this certainly is one of those minor Jewish holidays, it certainly is a very important holiday, and it has a very important message that you're never lost, it's never too late. And we could always, the Yiddish expression is Nishta kein verfallen. It's never too late. And that's what I want to talk with you about today, how we can always seize the opportunity and work out and fix up whatever situations need to be rectified, because, we always have situations in our lives that we can fix up. And this is just one of those lessons and messages that the Torah tells us about. So again, it's not going to be this week's parsha. We're going to look at we're going to fast forward to the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. We're going to look at a few fascinating ideas and try to understand what it's about. So, any questions before we begin? Okay, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to unmute yourself and join in the conversation. Would love to hear your points. But let's begin and let's talk about how this message of Pesach Sheni is so relevant to us, because we have to understand that, let's go back in history to a very special Pesach in the year 2449. That's the year after the Exodus, the first anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt. And that's when these people came to Moshe with this complaint, that why should they be left out? And the Gemara talks about this discussion. The Talmud says that this story, where it appears in the Torah, it seems out of chronological order of the sequence of events. Now remember, the book of Bamidbar takes its name from the census that Moshe conducted in the desert, right, which took place when, on the exact date was the first day of the second month. That's this month, the month of Iyar, in the second year after the Exodus from Egypt. That means this month is when this census took place. And what's the commonly known book, a commonly known name for this book of the Torah? Well, in Hebrew, it's Bamidbar, but another name that's given is Sefer Pekudim, the book of Numbers. Hence, in English, it's not called in the desert, as it is in Hebrew, but it's called Numbers. So the point, though, is it seems to be a little bit out of chronological order. And in fact, if you read Rashi explains that the Torah doesn't want to put the Pesach Sheni. Remember that there was first Pesach before the Jews left Egypt, which we read in book of Shemos in Exodus. So Rashi tells us the Torah doesn't want to put the desert Pesach, the second, not Pesach Sheni that I'm talking about now, but the second Pesach that occurred, meaning the first anniversary of Pesach, right at the beginning of Bamidbar, because it doesn't want us to look bad. And this is interesting, because if we just take into consideration what Pesach is about, right? When was Pesach celebrated? It's the month of Nisan. That means it's a month before Iyar. So something is out of place here. So here's the thing. If it's out of place, why is that? So if you look in the Torah itself, in a regular Chumash, you'll see Rashi's commentary. He says that God didn't want us to look bad. Now, how would we look bad? You see, that first year was the only time that Pesach, the Korban Pesach, was brought in the desert. But for the next 39 years, the Jews are traveling in the desert for 40 years. They never brought the Korban Pesach, just that once. So Rashi, in his commentary here, is telling us that it seems like a failure from our side, right? No, it's nice that we followed God's instruction in the year after the Exodus. But in the context of the 40 years that we sojourned, that we traveled through the wilderness, it doesn't look great that we didn't offer the sacrifice. So to avoid highlighting that shortcoming, that stain, that failure of ours, Rashi says, at least this is his explanation, that the Torah buried the desert Pesach story by placing it in a less conspicuous place in the middle of the book of Bamidbar rather than at the beginning. That's Rashi's commentary. It's almost like the guy who paid his taxes this year, but knows that he hasn't paid taxes for the last 20 years. So it's good that he paid this year, but he'd rather not talk about it because he'd rather not have SARS or any other government agency get too excited about his tax profile because he really should have been paying all these years till now. That's sort of what Rashi's saying in his explanation of this. So covering up the shame of failing to bring the Pesach sacrifice all of those years prior to this is the point that Rashi's saying, but there's a technical difficulty here. The blind spot in observance actually wasn't because we were lazy. The Jewish people actually had a very good reason for not bringing it all those years. What do you think it was? They actually weren't obligated to. Because the obligation to bring the Korban Pesach, if you look in the Torah itself, is only when we come to the land of Israel. And this is back in Shemos and Exodus where the Torah says this. And the Torah is quite clear about this. When God told the Jewish people in Egypt to slaughter the lamb and put the blood on the doorposts, the command was to keep this as a statute only. When you enter the land. That's what the Torah says. This is to be for eternity. They can offer the Pesach sacrifice. But when the Torah says, when you come to the land. And here Rashi says that this commandment is contingent upon our entry to the land. That means it's very clear in the Torah that you only have to offer the Korban Pesach once we arrived in Israel. So the one Pesach sacrifice that they did bring in the desert actually was an exception. It wasn't the rule. So how can we say that one sacrifice in the desert, as Rashi says, highlights this disgrace, this failure of ours? Such a disgrace? Why is it such a disgrace? There was no obligation to bring it. So what's this disgrace here? If they never had an obligation, a responsibility to do so. Get the question. So for this, my dear friends, I'm going to share with you a fascinating talk from the Rabbi. And he says that Rashi's answer, let me in fact read it to you in his original Yiddish, so bear with me. It says like this. Darf men verstehen, we have to understand what is Rashi telling us here. Why is Rashi turning this into a disgrace, an embarrassment for the children of Israel? It doesn't seem to make sense. What's the disgrace? Rashi already told us previously, very clearly, the Torah says you only have to offer the sacrifice when you come to the land of Israel. So they were obviously just following the rules. So the question then for us is, ladies and gents, can failure to do something that you're not obligated to do, is that in any way considered a disgrace? Could that be considered a disgrace? You were never obligated to do it. Why is that a disgrace? Let's fast forward in the Torah in order to understand this, because the Tosafists, commentaries on the Torah and the Talmud, they explain that the disgrace here is not the failure to bring the Korban Pesach for those 39 years per se. The disgrace was the fact that they actually spent 40 years in the desert. Remember, Egypt is not so far from Israel. In fact, the place where they gathered to offer this Pesach sacrifice on the first anniversary was, I don't know, less than 200, what was it? I don't know my maths. 230 miles. How many kilometers is that? Whatever the case is, wasn't very far from Israel, okay? Now, yes, there were no planes or trains or buses back then, that's true, but please, it's not a 40-year desert trek. It's not such a long journey. We had at our Pesach retreat a few years ago, a lady named, I'm forgetting her name. Those, if anyone here was there and remembers who it was, forgetting, what's her name? Whatever. It's in my head. She did the walk from Egypt to Israel on what they call the Exodus route. She says it's a few weeks walk by foot. And people did it. They actually walked through Saudi Arabia, from Egypt through Saudi Arabia, making their way to, it's called the Exodus route. So why did it take so long? Now, I know it's true that us Jews, sometimes it takes us time to get going. And maybe it's not just a Jewish tree. You ever try with the family, there's 9 of us, to get out on a Sunday to go on a trip somewhere? It takes some time till we get out of the house. The kids want to pack a picnic. I get caught in an email, this one, it just happens. So, right, by the time it's 3:00, that's when we start going and the places are shutting. But the point I'm making is, why did it take them 40 years to get to Israel? And this is something I'm going to read in a couple of weeks. We're going to fast forward then to the Parsha of Shlach, where the story of the Meraglim, the spies, right? When the spies came back with a negative report about the land, the people cried and they began a whole campaign, let's just go back to Egypt. And God decreed that the nation would then spend 40 years wandering the desert. It was a punishment. You're crying about nothing, I'll give you something to cry about. And that became the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, known as Tisha B'Av. Only the younger generation would merit to actually see the land of Israel, to actually get there. So this is what Tosfos says is the disgrace. Not that they should have brought the sacrifice in the desert all those years that they were there, but the fact that they were even in the desert for 40 years. It's embarrassing. You were on the way to Israel. You were almost there. The spies brought back a negative report. And just, there's many lessons about the negative report to the spies, which really on its own is a lesson, which I don't want to digress into, but it's just an important lesson for life that I think we could find. General Montgomery said the difficult we do immediately, and the impossible takes a little bit longer. It's an important lesson for us, what the problem of the spies was. Chassidus says that these spies, they preferred to actually live in the desert. You see, in the desert, they were basking in spirituality day and night. They had the Ananei Akava, they had the clouds of glory, they had the pillar of fire, they had the Mishkan. They were living a spiritual life. They didn't have to worry about agriculture, about food. Every day, manna fell from heaven. Life was good. Life was easy for them. And Chassidus explains that life is not necessarily supposed to be easy. We come into this world and labor. We have our job. We have our purpose. There's a reason God put us in this world. And therefore, one way of looking at it was that was their mistake. Another way of understanding it is the problem was not, listen, they were honest. They gave back a report of what they found. So the problem was not that they brought a negative report. They were just reporting. The problem, going back to General Montgomery's point, is they substituted the how with if. Instead of saying, how's it possible? There are struggles, there are challenges, there are difficulties. They substituted that with saying, well, we don't know even if it's possible. Remember, the very word impossible says, I'm possible. So don't say impossible. I remember once working with a particular rabbi on a certain project, and anything I suggested, he used to say, it's impossible. And I showed him how it was possible. Listen, I'm not such a tzaddik myself. I also face that sometimes, but I think it's an attitude we have to have. Not to always look at everything as doom and gloom, as impossible. So this perhaps is the embarrassment that we failed, that we wound up stuck in the desert during that time, and that we shouldn't have been. Now, if you want to look at it from that Hasidic perspective, well, they saw a certain advantage of actually living a desert life because it made them more spiritually sensitive and more spiritually attuned, and basically, they felt good that this was a good life in the desert. But that's not the purpose of life, to be stuck in a desert. But like I said, I want to share with you a different interpretation, the one from the Rebbe today. And at face value, when you look at the story about the desert Pesach and put it into context, we don't usually think about the sin of the spies, right? When we read about the desert sacrifice that they offer the Korban Pesach on the first anniversary, we don't even know yet about the sin of the spies, because at this point, the entry of the Jewish people into the land was actually imminent. They were just delayed because of the golden calf story, but they were on their way to enter the land of Israel. So that story, that incident didn't even yet occur. It only occurs a few months later in the month of Av. And now we're in Iyar. And the Pesach was in Nisan. So it only happened some 5 months later. So Moshe even tells the people, we're traveling to the land of Israel. We'll be there, he says, within 3 days. They were 3 days away from entering Israel. So can we say that the disgrace the Torah is trying to hide or bury the desert Pesach in the sin of the spies? You know, it's a story. It's a nice answer. But from the Rebbe's perspective, he wants to dig a little bit deeper. So that's not good enough. There are many mitzvahs which only took effect when the Jews entered the land of Israel. And just as the people weren't obligated to bring the Korban Pesach all those years in the desert, they could not let the land rest. For example, the Shemitah that this year is, or leave gifts of produce for the Kohanim and the Leviim and the poor and all the other tithes that we have. They didn't do that in the desert either. That only happened in Israel too. And unlike the Korban Pesach, which at least they brought the first year, those mitzvahs were all put on hold for the 40 years, not just 39 like the Korban Pesach. So why would the Torah pick the Korban Pesach as the flag bearer of the disgrace? Because we were delayed in entering the land. Why is this the disgrace? Right? Can't we point to other shortcomings, to other, not shortcomings, but other things we didn't have? There's got to be a word for this. Right? Why is this the prototype, the example of our failure? So let's put our questions aside for now and continue the Torah's narrative on the first Pesach, the first Korban Pesach in the desert, the year 2449. You know, as the nation was getting ready, visiting themselves, you know, preparing for Pesach is no easy task. We all know that, right? Regardless whether you're going on a retreat or you're staying at home, there's work to do. Actually, if you go on a retreat, it's easier. I'm only thinking from the perspective of an organizer. But whatever the case is, there was a group of people that we discussed before who felt left out. These were individuals who were ritually impure, and that's why they could not participate in this communal sacrifice. They knew that the Pesach sacrifice, like any sacrifice, can't be offered in a state of ritual impurity. But they wanted to participate in this monumental mitzvah. So they came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, Lama Nigara, why should we be left out? Why should we be deprived? And their claim was based on what they knew about the Korban Pesach already in the previous year, when they were, mind you, still in Egypt. Remember, when this whole thing with the lamb happened in Egypt, everyone participated. It didn't matter if someone was ritually pure or not, because it wasn't really a sacrifice yet then. There were no priests. There was no mishkan, no tabernacle, no altar, right? None of the typical sacrificial conditions that they previously had, which is a lesson we talked about in one of our pre-Pesach Zooms, the idea that your home became the temple. It was a home alteration. Your very home became the place. And that's why Pesach is a home-based celebration, right? So there was just an instruction to paint the blood on the doorposts, to eat the roasted meat with matzah and maror. Sounds like a delicious family bride, right? It wasn't even called a sacrifice. If you look in the Torah, the word is zevach Pesach, which literally means just a a shchita, not a sacrifice, but slaughtering, right? Now it's a year later, and Moshe tells the people that they're to observe, to do the same thing again in the desert. So the people really had no reason to believe that this should be any different than the way it was the previous year. If someone impure could eat it last year, why should that be different now, right? In fact, the people probably knew what we learned, that the true Korban Pesach only even becomes obligatory when they enter the land of Israel, which is what the Torah says. You're only going to offer it when you're in Israel. So we're planning to be in Israel, but we're delayed. So why should they lose out because they're ritually impure? That's the question. And Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, who was their faithful leader, he heard their concerns, he heard their question, and he brought their claim to God. And when he came back, he said to the people, no, this year's very different than last year. Last year, we didn't have a real sacrifice, but this year, even though we're not yet in Israel, God is instructing to bring a real sacrifice. And as you know, what's the rule when it comes to sacrificial offerings? What's the rule? If you're impure, you can't be part of it. But nevertheless, because you are so concerned, because you're asking, because you feel deprived and left out, that's why God says, I give you a second chance. And this is what's so unique about this holiday. It's not a holiday that was prescribed in the Torah. Now it is. It came from the people. They asked for it. It was their request. So it's really a holiday that was initiated by the people, grassroots. And from then on, every single year, Pesach Sheni became enshrined in law. It's written in the Torah. Anyone who couldn't bring the Korban Pesach the first time around due to ritual impurity, or because they were distant from the temple for whatever reason, they couldn't do the pilgrimage and couldn't make it to Jerusalem, they had a second chance. By the way, last year, many people were in quarantine. Not only that, some people missed Pesach. One of the famous people was Eli Beer, who's the director of Hatzalah in Israel. Eli Beer was in a coma throughout Pesach. He was in the US on a fundraising mission over Purim. He was raising funds. I think he was on the Jay Leno show. And he caught COVID in those early days of March. And he wound up in the hospital. I think he was in a coma for some 6 weeks. He woke up. He said, I'm getting ready for Pesach. They said to him, Pesach is long gone. Well, guess what? He seized the opportunity for Pesach Sheni, and he was able to celebrate Pesach the second time around. And I think this teaches us a very, very important message and lesson for each one of us in life. If you go back to them, it was the same thing. Pesach Sheni, they brought a Paschal lamb. They roasted it. They ate it with matzah and maror and all the goodies. It was the same exact story, just not on the right date, 1 month later. And in fact, if you look in the Talmud where it talks about the laws, it says, just as the original Pesach was able to override Shabbos, meaning on Shabbos you only offer a communal sacrifice. Korban Pesach was a communal sacrifice. And Hallel was recited as they offered it. And it was eaten, all the different details that the Torah tells us. The same thing applied to the second Pesach, right? But it wasn't a national holiday in the sense that you were still allowed to work, unlike in a regular Pesach. It wasn't a regular Yom Tov. It was just for those individuals. So the sacrificial element of it was the same as the real Pesach, but the day itself wasn't the same. Everyone, you could ride on buses, you could drive your car, you could be on your phone, you could be on Zoom, you could do whatever you like. It was pretty much business as usual, except for those who had to bring the sacrifice because they couldn't make it the previous time. And the Talmud talks about the difference between the first Pesach and the second Pesach, and there's a lot of detail about it that I'm not going to go into right now. But I think it's a very important message to all of us that we could learn from this, that God gave the second chance to those people to have another opportunity to observe Pesach. And why was it? Why did they merit this second Pesach, what could we learn from this second opportunity? Very simple. And it's a lesson we could all learn. The message is that if it's never too late in life. And this is a very important point because these people asked for it. You know, there's a tower in Chicago. It's called Willis Tower. Familiar with it? It was more famously previously known as Sears Tower. What happened? A couple of years back, Sears, which was a major American corporation with shops all over the place. When I was a kid, you had Sears everywhere. Well, they weren't, I guess, learning with the times. They weren't adapting, and other businesses like Amazon were taking over, and Sears was losing a lot of their business. And so they were no longer occupying as much space in their headquarters in Chicago. They shut a lot of their shops down. I think they still exist, but I actually don't even know if they still exist, but I haven't been living in the States for over a decade. And Sears was going mechula, bankrupt, out of business. And the owner, the landlord of that building, was looking for another anchor tenant. Comes along a Mr. Willis. Mr. Willis negotiates that he will occupy some 25% of the building. That's a big anchor tenant. He has a big insurance company in the Midwest. And you can Google the story if you want all the details. But negotiated a good deal. This is pre-COVID days, so people weren't working virtually. And Willis he became that new anchor tenant. On TV, they asked him, how did you get the name of the building to be renamed after you? The building was famously known as Sears Tower. And you want to know what his response was? Because I asked. Don't we see this right here? These individuals, they came to Moshe, they protested. They said, why should we lose out? They asked. Because they asked, even though that holiday didn't previously exist, God granted them a new holiday that wasn't previously part of the program. So if these Jews were not obligated to bring the Korban Pesach, yet they did do so, but it never happened again over the next 39 years in the desert. Again, back to our original question. What's the shame? By the way, there's a lot of messages and lessons. I hope you're all taking some notes. Very important what we're discussing. But I want to go back to our original question. If they were never even obligated to offer the Paschal sacrifice in the desert over those 40 years, then why is it such a shame that they did once and not the next? So back to this teaching of the Rebbe. He explains as follows. I just want to read his words and then try to paraphrase them. He said, nobody would have faulted them for not bringing the sacrifice, right? But yet they lined up to see if there was any way that they could offer it, even though they weren't obligated. Even in this case, right? They were ritually impure. They said, we know we're exempt, but lama nigara, why should we lose out? Right? Bringing the Pesach sacrifice is a tremendous mitzvah. We don't want to be exempt. We want to get in on the action. So even though nobody faults you for not participating, you don't have to. But they refuse to sit back and watch this mitzvah pass them by, that others could do the mitzvah, and others could celebrate and enjoy, and them not. So when God saw that these people, they weren't going to just take, hey, you don't need to do it, so I won't do it. That's not their attitude. They wanted to find a way, and that's why they came to Moshe. They said, please tell us how. Mr. Willis asked, is it possible? Part of our package, we're becoming an anchor tenant. Can you name the building for our company? And they got it. They asked, and it was granted. And so God made a new rule in the desert because they asked. Usually if you miss the boat, what can we do? You missed the boat, sorry. But here, in fact, it's a law in the Talmud, avar zmanai batel kabane, which means if you didn't offer a sacrifice in the proper time, sorry. You didn't pray today, you could pray tomorrow, but today's gone. Here, God scheduled another sacrifice for a whole month later. God gave them a new opportunity. God taught them Nishta, came farfal, and it's never too late. So this, of course, set a whole new precedent. You look at the proactive efforts that these people made to be part of this, right? That they wanted to be part of the sacrifice. And I think, if you think about it, they pretty much make everyone else look bad. The Jewish people brought the Korban Pesach in the desert the first year as commanded, because God made an exception, right? But they never did it after that. Also as commanded. God said you don't have to till you come to Israel. But why didn't they learn from these Pesach Sheni people? Those Pesach Sheni people weren't obligated to bring the sacrifice, but that didn't stop them in any way. They still managed to succeed, to participate. Why didn't the rest of the people in the desert that were with them get the same message? Once they knew they were staying in the desert for a long time, which God said that our generation will die out, why didn't they say, well, who cares if we're not technically obligated to bring it till we get to the land of Israel? But lama nigara, why should we be left out if we're never even going to make it to Israel? Let's ask God if we could at least do this here in the desert. And this, of course, is another way of seeing this. Surely, if a small minority was able to convince God to let them to participate in the Korban Pesach sacrifice, even though they were impure, and God gave them the second chance, God was so happy that they wanted to do this. The fact that they failed to take this initiative to learn from the Pesach Sheni message, that was perhaps, what's considered the disgrace here. So the Torah was telling us, the Torah is trying to avoid placing the whole desert sacrifice story at the beginning of the book of Bamidbar. And that's why it's, so to say, later buried inconspicuously 9 chapters later, so that we wouldn't look so negative, so we don't look so bad. So this, of course, is a message to all of us, that this subsequent failure of the Jewish people in the desert, that they didn't ask, that's the indignity. And hopefully, again, this is just one angle, one perspective. There's many messages we can learn. But I think it's certainly a message and lesson for each of us in our lives as well. When the Jewish people were in the desert, there were many mitzvahs that they weren't obligated to observe, which included the Korban Pesach. Right? We mentioned all the other types of mitzvahs they didn't have to observe. And today, there are many mitzvahs that we also don't do. We discussed this last week. First of all, many mitzvahs are only relevant to the land of Israel, and we're here. I don't see anyone on the group today from Israel, or wherever we might be. I do see someone from Australia. Hello, Esther. But there are 613 commandments in the Torah, right? That's a lot of mitzvahs. But many of them only pertain to particular times and only in certain places and different sets of circumstances. So for starters, let's use the sacrifice as an example. We don't have a temple, so we don't offer sacrifices today, right? That brings down off the bat the number of mitzvahs that we observe today to just 369. Let that sink in. That's right. Today, we cannot even do half of all the mitzvahs. So many of the mitzvahs are related to the sacrificial offerings that are brought in the temple. Oh, but we don't have a temple. That means so many of our mitzvahs we don't do. So of the remaining 369, many can only be observed in Israel. Okay, this year Shemitah, so we have an extra set of mitzvahs, but many people don't do it. Many people find loopholes, or in general, just, it's not for me. And for us outside of Israel, there are so many mitzvahs that we can't do, even today, unless you're in Israel. And many of those, right? Think about it. Shechita, slaughtering an animal, is a mitzvah. It's part of the 613 mitzvahs, right? But what if you're vegetarian? Actually, even if you're vegetarian, you could potentially still do it. What if you're not a butcher? What if you're not a shochet, right? You don't do that one, right? Let's think about it. Do you know that divorce is one of the 613 mitzvahs? You don't have to get divorced, okay? It's not an obligation. If you like your spouse, you could stay together. It's a mitzvah to pay your employees on time, okay? Not everybody does it. I'm not saying it's right, okay? So the point is, if you add up all the mitzvahs that we could do today, we're left with very, very few mitzvahs that we actually are able to observe. There are many mitzvahs that are just out of bounds. And I'm not going to go into the statistics today. So whatever mitzvahs we are able to do, are we doing all of them? Are we doing them with enthusiasm, with excitement, with passion? So we could either have an attitude that the Pesach Sheni people, that they had towards that very first Pesach when they left Egypt. Or we could say, you know what, it's not my problem. I didn't decide that we're stuck in the desert for the next 39 years. If we don't have to offer it, we don't have to do it. And those were both two attitudes we saw when the Jews were in the desert. It's possible that sometimes you might feel some relief knowing that I don't have to do this particular thing. Yeah, we didn't have to go to shul for quite a few months of lockdown last year. Many people enjoyed that break. To be honest, there was a little bit of time that I also did, right? Phew, I'm glad I don't have to do it. I get a little break. And you could think about how many instances where we feel that way. The question is, again, it might be different for the elderly, but I find many people today use it as an excuse that shul's a super spreader. I was calling one of my congregants recently who doesn't come to shul because he's scared of COVID. But he's on planes and he goes to restaurants and here and there and there. Let me ask you, practically speaking, is it an excuse or is it for real? You're really scared of COVID, but you don't mind in a restaurant where the masks come off, and in shul, we sanitize and we socially distance and we did have an outside. Please, it's an excuse and you know that. And which personality are we looking at here? Now, again, I'm not disparaging those who really are not going to shul because they're being safe, and it's across the board. They don't go to shul, but they also don't expose themselves much anywhere else. Gesundheit. You know, you basically being honest with yourself. That's fine and that's perfect. But for the individual who makes up that excuse, well, on which side of the boat are you is the question. And there's two sides here. There's two examples we can learn. The people who weren't obligated to bring the carbon Pesach and said, thank goodness. Or the people who said, even though I'm not obligated to bring it, I still want to. Please, God, can't you make a plan for me? When I have an obligation, I do it, and when and celebrate with joy. But when I don't have to, well, it's not my problem. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not condemning, though, that particular person. But I think that the story of Pesach Sheni teaches us which attitude we should try to inculcate in our lives. There was a group of people who were not obligated to bring the carbon Pesach offering, but they lined up, they protested to Moshe, they asked for permission that they should be able to bring it. Why? Because for them, mitzvahs were not just obligations, and I'm glad that I don't have to do it today, but as an opportunity. What do we say mitzvah means? An opportunity to connect with God, to celebrate my Judaism. And this approach teaches us such an important lesson about seizing the opportunity to do a mitzvahs, about being proactive in life, about looking for an opportunity to help another. Yeah, you don't have to many times, but why don't we seek out an opportunity to do a mitzvah? I'm not saying you need to have, every person over and expose yourself and get into and have more stress in your life. That's not the point. The idea is, you don't have to wait for a mitzvah to come our way. We can be proactive. Instead of waiting for your, someone you haven't spoken with, you pick up the phone and call them. Instead of waiting for the donation request from the organizations, you reach out. How could I help? There's so many ways you could put this into practice. And the Pesach Sheni approach is that even when a mitzvah doesn't come our way, we seek it out. And that's the point. Tzedakah is a good example that it's better to give tzedakah charity every single day of the year than to give just one large amount. There's a story that comes to mind even. One of the Chabad Rebbes talked about, a poor person asked him for charity on his way to, asked him for some charity on his way to shul. He said, you know what, I'm on my way to pray. Leave it, I'll give it to you later. And then he realized, it dawned on him, why should I wait till later? I have an opportunity now. I went to pursue and find that person. So, there might not be a poor person around. Are we going to look for a person to help out? Right? And this approach explains why people perhaps are more scrupulous or more mohudar, are more machmir when it comes to certain mitzvahs. Right? Take tzitzis as an example. Do you know that according to Torah law, a man only has to wear tzitzis if he's wearing a four-cornered garment? Okay? But yet, look around, you'll find most religious Jewish men are wearing tzitzis. Why? You don't have to. But we want to try to go into an attitude of doing mitzvahs, right? We want to look for the opportunity. And this is the message of Lama Nigara, that these particular Jews, they turned to God, they turned to Moshe Rabbeinu at the time, and they said, we want an opportunity. And there's so many other types of mitzvahs that you could look at. And so this is why, in fact, at the Pesach Seder, we have a prayer asking God that we should finally reinstate the Korban Pesach. We're sitting with our families, we're celebrating Pesach, we have the matzah, we have the maror, we have the wine. What's the problem? The problem is that for nearly 2,000 years, the Seder table is incomplete. The Korban Pesach, the actual Paschal sacrifice, that's what's missing. Are we okay with that? Pesach Sheni teaches us not to accept the status quo, not to say it's okay. God forbid. We have to be proactive. We have to reach out to God. We have to find the good to do. And that's the blessing we say in our Seder. And so, my friends, the message to each of us today is let's seek out mitzvahs to do. Let's seek out good to do. Let's take that approach that the Jews in the Pesach Sheni story showed us. We have two examples in the Torah. One is where Pesach was not celebrated for all those years because we weren't obligated to. And we have another, which is, well, even if I'm not obligated to do it, I still want to find that opportunity. And we know that there are many mitzvahs that today we can't observe, as we discussed. Should we be okay with that? Of course not. So let's not accept the status quo. Let's ask God, Lama Nigara, why should we lose out? It's not just at the Pesach Seder, but every day we could turn to God and say, what can we do to make redemption in the world? There's a lot of injustice in the world. There's a lot of problems in our world. We wish that those issues could be fixed. And we know that the final solution would be with Mashiach. So it's not just about a lip service. Okay, we say in our prayers, every day. When we say these words, we should realize what it's about. All the darkness and struggles and challenges and problems that we have in our world. And when we see those problems, can we reach out and say, how am I going to shed more light? What am I going to do? And we see those around us who could perhaps use more light. What could we do to make that difference? We shouldn't just anticipate redemption. Let's precipitate it. Let's make it happen. Let's make it a reality in our lives. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Rav?
Yeah.
If we did partake of Pesach,
yeah.
What should we do for Pesach Sheni if we had already celebrated Pesach?
Yeah, of course, we all did. This year, practically speaking, all we do on Pesach Sheni now is we recall this message. We discuss the significance, the importance, for example, what we said today. And it's been our motto here at the Chabad Seniors programs all these years. It's never too late. What in life do you want to catch up on? What opportunities? What can you do to make it happen? If you have certain aspects of life that you want to make a reality, that you want to catch up on, what can you do? Now, I'm not saying you're gonna have to start that you always wanted to go skydiving or whatever you've been missing out on, that now you're gonna make that a reality. But be realistic. What aspects in life do you really feel that you're missing out on, that you wish you can make a reality, and how are you going to make them a reality? It's never too late. Take, for example, our shiur. Many people who participate in our classes have told me that for them, they never made it, for whatever reason. They worked hard, they didn't get a Jewish education, whatever it may have been, why they couldn't learn. And now they have an opportunity to catch up on their Torah studies. So this is another example of nishtaken verfallen. It's never too late. It's Pesach Sheni. Don't be lazy. You got another chance. Remember that message. You have another chance. All right, ladies and gents, any other questions or thoughts? Okay, with that in mind, sei gesund. Good to see you all. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us.